What's up guys, Milky Way season is just around the corner, and here's everything you need to know about astrophotography. In this guide I'll be covering when and where to shoot, what gear to bring, the settings to use, as well as the creative process behind capturing the Milky Way, star trails, northern lights and time-lapse. If you know any of this stuff already or you're just interested in one particular thing, I will leave timestamps down in the description. I will see you after the intro. I highly recommend doing enough planning before every shoot to ensure everything's going smoothly. There are helpful apps out there like PhotoPills that lets you see the location of the moon and the Milky Way. If you want to photograph the Milky Way and you live in the northern hemisphere, you'll be able to see its core from around March until October, with the best time starting late April until late July. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you can call yourself lucky. You'll be able to see its core from around February until October, with prime viewing times being June and July. Make sure there are no or just very few clouds. They will be blocking your view of the night sky and that's pretty annoying. Also make sure you pick a dark and clear night. Generally, shooting at around new moon is best. Though it's pretty impossible to shoot the Milky Way during full moon, don't be afraid to try some long exposures anyway. You might just be rewarded with some pretty unique and interesting photos. For your photo location, try to find a place with low levels of light pollution. The more light pollution, the less stars you'll be able to see. There are some pretty good light pollution maps online. I will link one down in the description. If you live in a city, taking photos of the night sky can be pretty frustrating. However, it can be a nice motivation to get out into nature once in a while. Usually, driving around 1 or 2 hours is enough to escape most of the light pollution, depending on how bright and large your city is. Just like in landscape photography, having an interesting subject to photograph besides the sky is pretty important, so keep that in mind when choosing your location. If you are far enough north, photographing the northern lights can be very exciting. I'll talk more about that at the end of this video. Of course, if you are far enough south, like in New Zealand's Fiordland or Australia's Tasmania, you can also get lucky and see the southern lights, which are a bit more rare though. If you don't care too much about the Milky Way or northern lights, and all you want to do is photograph these stars or star trails, all you need is a dark and clear sky. I will talk more about star trails at the end of this video. Alright, now that we talked about when and where to do astrophotography, let's move on to gear. Firstly, you'll need a camera that lets you do your settings manually. Generally, full-frame cameras are best, because most of the time when you want to photograph the night sky, you want to be pretty wide. Full-frame cameras are not cropped like APS-C or MFT cameras, and they also have a lot less noise when you pump up the ISO, which can definitely be helpful in astrophotography. If you don't have a full-frame camera, don't let that stop you. I've taken all of my astrophotos on Fujifilm's APS-C cameras, such as the Fujifilm X-T1, which you can probably get for a few €100 by now. Even more important than the camera that you'll be using is going to be the lens. I recommend using a wide-angle lens, one reason being that you'll be able to capture more of the night sky. Also, you'll be able to use slower shutter speeds. I'll explain that further when I talk about camera settings. Also, be aware that it's best to use fast lenses. f2.8 or faster will give you pretty good results. Prime lenses are great because usually they're faster and more affordable than zoom lenses. Of course, if you've got a suitable zoom lens like a 16-35 f2.8, that's a great choice too. For most of my astrophotos, I've used Fujifilm's 16mm f1.4, which is a great lens for astrophotography and really sharp. If you don't have a suitable wide-angle lens, don't be afraid to use your kit lens. If you use the right settings and have a good composition, you can still get nice results. Besides your camera and lens, the most important thing you'll need is a steady tripod, since you will have to do long exposures to capture the night sky. It's also useful to bring a remote shutter to set custom exposure times and avoid shaking your tripod. If you don't have one, you can also set your shutter speed in camera and then use a self-timer of 2 seconds. Ideally, it's going to be very dark when you go shoot, so make sure you have some kind of light source like a headlamp or a flashlight. Don't just rely on your phone, always have a backup light to be safe. It's best to use a red light as that makes it easier for your eyes to adjust to the darkness, and it's also more considerate towards animals and other photographers. Depending on where you go shoot, it can also get very cold during night, so make sure your clothes are warm enough and bring multiple layers. Often you need a lot of patience as well, so it can be nice to have some food and a warm drink. Shooting alone at night somewhere in nature can be a bit scary, so if that's something you're struggling with, try to find someone else who's also interested in astrophotography and go together. Whatever you do, always keep your safety a priority and also be considerate towards nature, which means sticking to the paths and not leaving any trash. Now let's finally talk about camera settings. Firstly, always shoot in RAW to capture as much detail as possible and have the highest flexibility when editing your photos. Also, you want to use the largest aperture possible, such as f1.4 or 2.8, to capture as much light as you can. Don't go too high with your ISO or you'll introduce a lot of noise to your photo, especially if your camera has a cropped sensor like mine. I often use an ISO somewhere in between 800 and 2500, but I'm also using an aperture of 1.4, so if your lens is not that fast you might have to go a bit higher. If you are using a full frame camera like a Sony a7 III, you can easily go higher with your ISO without introducing too much noise. For your shutter speed, stick to the rule of 500. If you expose your photo for too long, the stars will start to trail due to the rotation of the Earth. You can use this to create star trail photos, but most of the time you want your stars to be sharp. If you divide the number 500 by your actual focal length, you will get the maximum time you can expose your photo before the stars will start to trail. So for example, with a 16mm lens on an 8pse camera, I can use a shutter speed of around 20 seconds. If your camera has a cropped sensor like mine, don't forget to consider the crop factor in your calculation. Since it's going to be very dark during night, you will have to use manual focus, which I always set just a tiny bit before infinity. To check if your stars are sharp, you can pick the brightest star in your frame and zoom in on that to make sure it's the smallest it can be. If you want your foreground to have as much detail as possible, you can take a separate exposure where you focus on the foreground, use a smaller aperture like f4 and a longer shutter speed like a few minutes. You can also do light painting or take a photo of your foreground before it gets dark. When you're back home, you can then stack those different exposures together in programs like Photoshop. I can also recommend turning off the long exposure noise reduction, since that will only cost you a lot of time on location for something that you can achieve in your editing software. Also turn off the image stabilization of your lens, since you'll be shooting on a tripod anyway. If you want your stars to be perfectly sharp, you might also want to consider using an electronic shutter, since a mechanical shutter can make your camera shake just a tiny bit. Photographing the night sky might be a bit more technical than other forms of photography. However, the creative process behind it is equally important. Pay attention to your composition. Having an interesting foreground like a flower or a mountain is crucial to creating an interesting photo. For example, if you're shooting at a lake, it might be interesting to work with the reflections of the night sky. Earlier I mentioned star trail photography. You can get some really unique and interesting photos by exposing for 30 minutes or more. The photo that you're seeing right now was exposed for more than an hour. To be able to expose my photo that long, I had to use a lower ISO and a smaller aperture. However, you can also set your camera to the interval mode and, for example, take 120 30-second exposures. When you're back home, you can then stack those photos together in programs like StarStax to get your final star trail image. One advantage of this method is that your camera will less likely overheat and there will be less noise and artifacts. You can then also turn those photos into a time-lapse, which is always pretty nice. I've also mentioned the northern lights earlier, which for me are the most exciting part about astrophotography. But of course, to photograph these you have to be pretty far north in countries like Iceland, Norway or Canada. One difference when you're shooting them is that you often have to use faster shutter speeds, since they can be quite bright and move quickly. If you are lucky enough to be in an area where northern lights are common, you can use the northern lights forecast as well as the weather forecast to predict when you will be able to see them. If you want to take a time-lapse of the Milky Way, stars or northern lights, all you have to do is set your camera to the interval mode and have a lot of patience. For example, when I'm shooting a Milky Way time-lapse, I usually keep my exposure around 20 seconds, with 1 or 2 seconds between each shot. If I want my final time-lapse to be around 10 seconds long, I will have to wait 1.5 hours. The longest time-lapse I've done so far consisted of around 700 photos, which took me between 4 and 5 hours to shoot. Especially for time-lapse, I recommend using an electronic shutter to avoid camera shake and also to spare your mechanical shutter. If you'd like me to make more in-depth videos on star trails, northern lights, time-lapse or how I edit my astro photos, let me know down in the comments. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can head over to my website or my Instagram, which I'll both link down in the description. I also sell my photos as prints like the ones behind me, if that's something you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching, see you next time.